Welcome to a special episode 107 of War Room Impeachment. Honored to have a special guest here and a special book. You know, I've been talking about this a lot the last couple of weeks. The book is Trump and His Generals, The Cost of Chaos, and the author is Peter Bergen. And Peter now joins us here. He was on one of our live episodes during the week and now joins us. We're going to get into the book. In people's busy lives, right? They got so much going on, and one of the powers of news services like we try to do is we try to distill everything down so people get it. In a busy life, give us the rationale. Why should somebody buy Trump and His Generals, and why should they take the time to read it?
You know, I talked to about 100 people involved in the Trump administration, foreign officials who dealt with the Trump administration. I think it's an effort to treat the president fairly. I think for people who love Trump, they may be disappointed by the book. For people who hate Trump, they may be disappointed by the book. It's an attempt to tell...
Why would people that love Trump be disappointed by the book?
Well, I think this is, because, I mean, it's not, look, from a commercial...
It's not a hagiography of Trump.
It's not a hagiography. I mean, from a commercial point of view, what works is to confirm people's prejudices in either direction, right?
And modern book publishing, right?
Right. I mean, we've seen that works. Look, Trump is a very important figure. The reason that he decided to write the book is this was going to be a consequential presidency. However, and the first president who hadn't served in the military or had public office, it was going to be different. It was unclear how different it was going to be, and there are some commonalities with Obama, which are interesting with President Trump. I mean, they both were outsiders in a sense from the sort of conventional political class. They both wanted to get America out of these endless wars. They both saw themselves as in part elected on that. And so one of the themes of the book is, the extent to which Obama and Trump, I mean, obviously there are big differences on Iran, on climate change, but when it comes to the question of how to approach jihadist terrorism, they've largely adopted we're not going to send big conventional armies into the Middle East. We're going to have drone warfare, special operations, special forces. So there are some commonalities. Of course, there are big differences as well.
One of the very first things that General Flynn talked about in that we did in the beginning of the administration, you see in the book, is that President Trump wanted to go to a more conventional Scowcroft model of the National Security Council being kind of a curation, and he would devolve back power. And that's one of the reasons you had generals. You had General Mattis, General McMaster, General Kelly, General Dunford, and General Flynn, at least initially. So you had five generals that were part of this.
And as you know, the serious consideration to General Petraeus as Secretary of State.
General Petraeus came in and talked as Secretary of State. But President Obama, one of the reasons is that when Flynn, delved down there, that President Obama's took all the power into the White House, and he had Susan Rice, and he had Ben Rhodes, and they had a White House counsel's office very involved in their decisions. They had the targeting up in the down where the National Security Advisor's offices are. And President Trump wanted to do a different model of that and really devolve power back to the Pentagon, back to the CIA, back to kind of fight these wars, and particularly the war against ISIS, first thing. In hindsight, do you think, given what your book says, in hindsight, do you think President Trump should have followed more of the Obama model, which Obama really took all that power away from the apparatus and centralized it into the White House?
Every president gets the National Security Council he or she wants, right? I mean, that's just the way it operates. And President Obama, there was a lot of micromanaging from the White House of certain military operations
because he really didn't trust the apparatus.
I don't know whether look, every White House tends to concentrate power in the White House. I mean, and that's because I think with every presidency we've seen this more and more. There's just a natural tendency. But I mean, in the case of Trump, he did devolve authorities down to the commanders on the ground or the commanders of CENTCOM to do operations. They didn't have to Mother May I all the time at the White House. So that is different. And I think if you look at the campaign against ISIS, Trump I think did make he took the Obama plan and he amped it up in certain ways, putting a lot more troops into Syria. There were only 500. Obama had capped it at 500. There were 2,000. Obama capped the number of helicopters.
But there was a difference that he wanted the destruction of the physical caliphate. He focused on something that was very specific as far as an objective.
Well, I mean,
not to have it as a generational.
I think we can debate about what the language. I mean, Obama, but by the account of the general who was leading the war, had killed 50,000 members of ISIS 6 months before he left office. So I mean, both presidents had a pretty aggressive point. I do think that Trump amped it up. he kind of moved, he got this thing to move quicker. He and Mattis had a kind of mind meld on this, and the proof is in the pudding, because by the end of 2017, ISIS had been largely geographically defeated. Of course, they haven't gone away completely, but
in the
good
fall,
enough.
taking down Mosul and Raqqa both around the end of 17, early 18.
Yeah, and I think that this was a very successful operation.
We did that. It wasn't part of a big part of the fighting done by the Shiite militias in that, particularly in Mosul.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, a lot of the fighting was. I mean, here's another thing that Trump, I think, got right, which is the decision to arm the Kurds. I mean, that was something that the Obama team had debated for in the last months when they were in office. You can't take a city like Raqqa with only American special forces. It's a big city. I mean, if you could take and hold, you're going to need ground forces. So Trump authorized arming the Kurds, 60,000, essentially the Syrian Democratic Forces, and this was another change. So. I think Trump inherited a good set of plans from Obama, and I think he took them and he amped them up.
The book is Trump and His Generals, The Cost of Chaos by Peter Bergen. Did you go into this? And I think one of the reasons that the book, I think, is so powerful, you've really been here from the beginning of the war on terror, wherever we call it. In fact, when 9/11 fell, I remember on CNN, you were the guy that actually had tracked down Osama bin Laden years before. You had actually had the interview, correct me, in the cave with Osama bin Laden
in '97.
In '97, I mean, you were on this story in the '90s when every now and again you would have a cruise missile strike to maybe get the attention off the impeachment process, but it wasn't something that was in the forefront of people's mind. You were all over it, and then you came really to prominence, at least in American consciousness, because of your position at CNN and the fact that you really had, when they were looking for experts, you really were an expert.
Yeah, I mean, I've been following this for a long time. There's no, the war is gone. I mean, look, if we did have this conversation in 2002, and we're still in Afghanistan, we're still in Iraq, we're still in Syria. I mean, none of this was predictable. I mean, it's gone on a long time. But I think the president has confused kind of two issues, which I think are important. I think there's a difference between a persistent presence and endless wars. And you could imagine a kind of policy in Afghanistan, which I think we're moving towards. What's fascinating to me, Steve, is the Trump administration now is very close to where the Obama administration on the question of Afghanistan. There's almost exactly the same number of troops. There's kind of the same discussions about, if we pull the plug completely, Al-Qaeda, ISIS come back. So I think the Trump administration is getting to a place where it'll be a persistent presence.
Well, is that because President Trump just ultimately, what you do is you just give way to the apparatus. The apparatus wins. The apparatus wants the expeditionary. You're
the political guy. Here's the argument. I think, which is in the book. General Dunford essentially at one point said, "Look, no one likes to pay life insurance, but you pay life insurance because it's dumb not to." And so essentially what the generals were arguing was it's a form of life insurance to remain there in Afghanistan. And they, in everybody's mind was to pull out from Iraq at the end of 2011 during the Obama administration, and then into that, the vacuum, ISIS comes 3 years later. So that, it's not like this is an abstract idea that they were advocating. And I think, I think you were part of these, discussions about Afghanistan. I think the president came down to the only thing worse than staying is leaving, particularly in a precipitous manner, and that's why we have the speech on August 21st, 2017 from the president saying, "I changed my mind."
When you started the book, what was the initial? What gave you the idea? Why did you frame this? This book is framed very differently than the Woodward book or anything else that's come out. What was it gave you the idea to do it, and then what did you find out as you did your research? Because you took a couple of years to do the research on this.
Well, I mean, I started thinking about doing a book about ISIS, and then somebody I really respect said, "Why don't you do a book about the Trump team and the world they're going to make or are making?" And I knew a number of people who worked for Trump, and then I thought it was going to be. This was during the transition, you talk to lots of people, and some people are helpful, and some people are not helpful, and Some people you can go back to, and some people you can't, and that's the process. And I didn't come in with like an a priori, I mean, there were certain facts that this is the first American president who hadn't served in the military or in public office, and one of the reasons that he selected all these generals is, the Never Trump movement essentially meant that, like, in any normal kind of administration, you've got 200 people are standing by to walk into the deputy assistant secretary. It's all mapped out. In this case, none of that was mapped out, and a lot of people are taking themselves out of consideration. The generals,
because the heart of the Never Trump movement is the Republican national security apparatus.
yeah, or you can say the Republican National Security Establishment. They were not.
Why did they? You know these guys well. You've interviewed them. Why do they hate Trump so much? It's not just they disagree with him. They go to this thing about his character, about him as a person, not as a decision maker. Why does it seem like the most hatred of Trump outside of Democrats comes from this national security apparatus of the Republican establishment?
Well, I think they disagree about policy pretty fundamentally. They think NATO is a good idea. They don't like Vladimir Putin. There's areas I think of agreement, for instance, on China, and then Trump is. I mean, I do say in the book that Lyndon Johnson wasn't the world's nicest guy. Bill Clinton lied about a sexual affair that he had in the Oval Office with an intern, and we're not electing people who are nice. We're electing people who are effective. I mean, that's the. And so the fact that Trump is personally not a particularly nice guy, to me, is like neither here nor there. And I think people should get past that and think about what it is that he's doing. And I think on China, I think he largely got it right. And we can disagree on the trade kind of back and forth, because I think that had the ability to kind of really affect global economic confidence. We seem to be at a point where that's over. On ISIS, he got it right. On the drawing a line on the Syrian use of weapons of mass destruction, he got that right. He made a fairly conciliatory speech, I think, in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, in his first year in office. I disagree with other things that he's done. I think the Iran deal is working, but that's a whole other can of worms.
Let's go in the book. I want to go through the thumbnail sketch about the generals, and let's start. There's 5 generals. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. It really revolves around Flynn, Mattis, Kelly, McMaster's, and Dunford. Yeah, those are the major dramatic personalities.
And Dunford plays the because Dunford is the chairman. Obviously, he's not. He's part of the chain of command,
right.
and he's not. He's at the table, but he's not necessarily the guy who's making a lot of the arguments that are in the National Security Council.
Well, let's talk about Flynn first. Give us your thumbnail sketch of Flynn.
Well, I think, Flynn was a very successful colonel in Joint Special Operations Command. He was well regarded. I think that over time he got essentially fired from the Defense Intelligence Agency as a 3-star. Partly because of his management style. He pissed off Jim Clapper, who was then the head of National Intelligence, and also Mike Vickers, who was the Undersecretary for Intelligence. They thought he was a bad manager. From that point forward, I think that he embraced some neoconservative ideas. He wrote a book with Michael Ledeen, who's kind of one of the dean of the neoconservative movement. I think he started engaging in some conspiracist ideas about, which I mentioned. One of the ideas in the book is that there are signs in Arabic at the border pointing people to how to cross the border. I mean, this is not true. And I think he embraced, and I think Flynn played a very, very important role for Trump, because there was really little question that Hillary Clinton wouldn't qualify as commander-in-chief. She'd been Secretary of State. She was on the Senate Armed Services Committee. She was to the right of Obama on a lot of issues, Afghanistan, Syria, but people did have concerns about Trump. But the fact that Mike Flynn, a relatively recently retired 3-star general, war hero, served in Afghanistan and Iraq, no one else in the Trump team had this kind of background. I mean, there was Keith Kellogg, who came in later. But he'd left. He'd left active duty back, a long time ago. He didn't have any experience of the wars we were actually in. So Flynn, I think, played a very important role for Trump as sort of a validator and somebody who'd be on the campaign trail, and who was, somebody who's a well-regarded military officer.
What about, let's talk Jim Mattis. What's your thumbnail sketch of Mattis?
Well, I think, one of the big themes in the book is Jim Mattis kind of slow-rolled or stonewalled. I mean, it's hard to imagine the Soleimani kind of assassination, targeted killing, however you want to characterize it, against the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani happening on Mattis's watch. I don't think he would have allowed that to be presented as an option to the president. He went
It would
out-
not even been in the briefing.
It wouldn't have been in the brief. I mean, look, these are all total hypotheticals, but I mean, Mattis went out of his way not to provide military options on Iran. He was very concerned, despite the fact that when he ran Central Command, he was very anti-Iranian. He had changed, and he basically thought that the Iranian deal was working. It was negotiated with the French and the Germans and the British at considerable pain to all concerned. We made our word. We shouldn't pull out of this agreement unilaterally. And it's one of the policy questions on which he lost, right? I mean, I think, Steve, it's very important to understand that I think we're talking about people who are grown-ups, right? So, of course, there are going to be differences about like how people approach things, how people treat each other, and is he a nice guy or not. But there were really substantive policy differences. I mean, Mattis disagreed with him on Iran, disagreed with him on the blockade of Qatar, disagreed with him on the kind of sort of the transgender thing, or like disagreed with him on North Korea, disagreed with him on NATO, disagreed with him on Putin. I mean, these policy differences began to add up, and
So the trade-off of where he did agree with him on the takedown of the physical caliphate,
Yeah.
you're saying counterbalance itself with other fundamental policy decisions.
Well, another area, of course, they both agreed on was the need to like really lamp up the defense budget. And if you look at the defense budgets under President Obama, they averaged like $600 billion a year. Well, we just had one that's making its way through on the Hill that it said 738 billion. So I mean, these are, and I think they, I think they fundamentally agreed that there was a necessity to, we have peer competitors, the Chinese and the Russians. The Russians are ultimately not really our peer competitor because their economy is the size of Italy's. But I think they broadly agreed on this issue. But they had substantive disagreements on a lot of other things.
What about General McMaster? What's your thumbnail sketch on McMaster?
Well, General McMaster is a guy who was a war hero in the first Gulf War and the second
Awarded
Iraq
the
War.
Silver Star.
Awarded
Right,
the Silver Star. I only discovered in the course of reporting the book that he was he was wounded. Not something he talks about in the Iraq War. He served a long tour in Afghanistan. He wrote A Dereliction of Duty, which is an essential book about the Vietnam War. I think that he and Mattis and Tillerson, the Secretary of State, did not see eye to eye. Mattis and Tillerson had a kind of mind meld, and H.R. McMaster was sort of left out of that. And I think
What was that? Was that mind meld something on policy, or was it about personality?
I think it was mostly about personality. I mean, at the end of the day, H.R. McMaster was still in uniform when he was the National Security Advisor. He was a 3-star general. And in meetings, Mattis would refer to him as Lieutenant General McMaster. People in the meetings understood that to mean, look, you're a 3-star general, I'm a 4-star general, and you're kind of junior to me. And ultimately, Secretary of Defense is your boss if you're in uniform, and then the Commander-in-Chief. So I think he was in an awkward position. He certainly, Tillerson and Mattis got on well, and they, so I think it was personalities and. But the other thing, I think HR was willing to challenge the president on the question of the Afghan war. And I quote somebody in the book, he took a lot of face shots on this. And I think some of his, you only have so much political capital. He was willing to sacrifice a lot of political capital on the question of the Afghan war.
The book is Trump and His Generals, The Cost of Chaos. The author is Peter Bergen. We're here on a special episode of War Room Impeachment. General Kelly. General Kelly, both at first when he comes on as DHS and then later as Chief of Staff.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that Jim Mattis was the commander of the Marines as a 2-star general going into Baghdad in 2003. Who was his deputy? A 1-star general named John Kelly. And by the way, who was one of their key colonels? A colonel called Colonel Joe Dunford.
Yep.
So I mean, look, you go into war together. I mean, it doesn't get any bigger in terms of a kind of joint experience. And so, for some people, Jim Mattis always retained a deputy in the White House called John Kelly, even though he was Chief of Staff and nominally in the chain of command would be, in a sense, higher. So these guys had a very close relationship, and they had common experiences. And one of their common experiences was, John Kelly lost a son in Afghanistan. Mattis had fought in Afghanistan. Joe Dunford had run the Afghan war. So these guys knew each other very, very well. And and it's not a surprise to me that when Jim Mattis left in December of 2018, at the end of that month, I mean, John Kelly was out the door within within days of that, right? I mean, he'd already lost the confidence of the president since they were no longer talking, and Kelly, so that those guys are all gone. I mean, their replacements, I think, are very different people now.
Talk to us about Joe Dunford.
Yeah, Joe Dunford. He's known as Fighting Joe. He does. As I said, I think his place. Jim Mattis, by the way, was careful to not include. Jim Mattis was very concerned about Trump issuing some sort of order to some of the. Jim Mattis kind of kept the relationship of the Pentagon and to Trump to himself, for good or for ill. I mean, he didn't. Joe Dunford. We know from logs at the White House that under Obama, Dunford was a frequent visitor. There are no formal logs to the White House, but you can kind of sort of put it together. Joe Dunford was not a frequent visitor to the White House under President Trump. Mattis kept that relationship to himself.
The Secretary of Defense. There's been 2 other books out, the Anonymous book,
Yeah.
right, and also Nikki Haley's book.
Yeah.
And both of those are pretty adamant about call it a coup or not following the orders, but the Anonymous goes out of its way to say the steady state and highlights the fact that a lot of orders or issues that the commander-in-chief wanted to address were not addressed or addressed in their own way. And then Nikki Haley actually calls out, which I thought was pretty stunning, Mattis and Tillerson as being people that actively talked to her about not following certain directives of the commander-in-chief. In your reporting and in your assessment and in the book, and the book is Trump and his generals, the cost of chaos, do you back up? Do you get a sense that there was, I don't call it a cabal, but there was it started to at least ossify this thing that President Trump as commander-in-chief is not correct in what he's doing, is not giving us correct orders, or we're going to have our own attitude?
I think that is true. And I'll give you a specific case of this. So
that's a pretty shocking statement.
Well, let me unpack it a bit. So because the example explains better than just sort of characterization.
Then that's worth buying the book. Trump and his generals: the cost of chaos.
So the Trump Vice President Pence and H.R. McMaster asked the Pentagon in the fall of 2017, when relations with North Korea are really not good, for us to basically to present a war game at Camp David about what the military options are.
Yes.
And Mattis Mattis doesn't respond. He doesn't.
I had opined before I left the White House in an interview what I thought of that. What I opined to what I thought of thinking like that.
Oh yeah, well, wasn't that part of your exit plan?
Yes. So later they tried to do a war game.
Yeah, and the war game didn't happen because Mattis basically slow rolled.
How can a war game not happen? Because
the
Vice President of the United States wants to have a war game, and the National Security Advisor.
If the Pentagon doesn't send war planners, you can't have a war game. So this is one of there are other examples in the book about Iran.
Can we go a couple of examples?
So on Iran, Mattis didn't provide the military options the president was seeking. He was concerned that, I quote him in the book saying, we have to make sure that reason doesn't trump impulse. Now, this does raise, I think, a huge set of questions about civil-military relations and kind of what...
This is the key point.
It is, yeah. And...
The reason I think this thing is so fascinating, I have argued that, and leaving the Kennedy assassination aside and all that, just leave that aside, there has been one other attempted coup, military coup in history of the United States, and that was General McClellan and the Democratic generals around General McClellan in the late summer of 1862, right before Antietam, where there was an open talk about that Lincoln didn't know what he was doing. This is after Second Manassas Peninsula. He didn't know what he was doing, that there had to be some negotiated settlement, or that these generals knew better. They thought that Lincoln was a hapless, over his head commander-in-chief. Many guys in his cabinet had started with that idea, Seward and others, but they started to get to understand what Lincoln was trying to do. But there you actually have a time when the American military establishment, at least as presented by McClellan, who at that time was still, was chief of staff of all the armies and the head of the Army of Potomac, actually questioned the commander-in-chief, and you could see a breach. And that was put after Antietam. He fired him, basically got rid of these guys. Here, and I think it's and this is why I think this book is so important. I think this book's got to be read in conjunction with the Anonymous book. I think this book's got to be read in conjunction with Nikki Haley's book. I think many decades from now, people are going to go back at this time and say, regardless of whether you agree with Mattis or Kelly or McMaster's, or you agree with Donald Trump, we're at an inflection point here on civil military matters. Just like in this impeachment is about separation of powers between the House and the executive branch here, and you bring it up, You couple that with the Afghanistan papers that have basically came out at the same time of your book. You then have 4 or 5 major documents, and yours is probably the most well reported, that you see that brewing was this whole concept of if a guy's elected as commander-in-chief, right? And particularly elected in a sense that the American people and the Afghanistan papers, I think, support this. Working class and middle class people, the deplorables, have basically said, we see what's going on, but we don't fully understand it. It's never really given it to us straight. And we've supported it. We supported these wars at the beginning, but we're now 17 or 18 years in it. And, your concept of persistent presence to them looks like my kids and my money are going, my blood and treasure are being spent over there, and I'm never given the straight story. That's the power of the book. The power of the book is that you actually go through and see it. And what's so shocking, and here's why, and I'm not a conspiracy theory guy. You and I have talked about this many times. I'm not a deep state guy. I say it's right in your grill. We'll talk about China in that example. But one of the reasons I think, one, you're not a self-promoter, you're a humble guy, but that the book hasn't gotten, even like Nikki Haley's book did and the Anonymous book, have not gotten the emphasis, because to me they're so shocking when read together. In the Afghanistan papers, which I think is the best reporting I've seen done since the Pentagon papers, also kind of came and went. You have 4 major documents, is that the established order doesn't want to talk about it. It is if you go through your incidences, and what you have to sit there and go, hey, I understand Trump's supposed to be a disruptor. I understand Trump, Trump, you say it's the cost of chaos. The emphasis there is, I'm sure under Trump, but you see that the established order, they're kind of going to do what they want. They kind of have an idea of what they want to do, and that's the way it's going to be. Am I wrong in that?
Well, look, I'm not. The word coup is.
And you're not a Trump, and you're not a Trumpanista.
The word coup would be massively overwrought in this context. But I mean, certainly, look, Mattis slow-rolled and stonewalled on some of these military options. There's just,
But that's stonewalling and slow walking. It happens all the time in the bureaucratic process.
Yeah,
that happens. This is what I'm trying to say. The book is Trump and His Generals: The Cost of Chaos. If you're a Trump fan, or if you detest, if the sound of his name irks you, this book should be read. But it's one thing about bureaucratic to and fro. In the Obama administration, you saw that. In the Bush administration, you saw that. In Lyndon Johnson, you read Dereliction of Duty. You see that. But what you highlight is different than just slow roll.
Okay, well, so it opens with a scene that you're a backbencher for, which is July 20th, 2017, which I sort of characterize as probably one of the most important meetings of the Trump presidency. Because basically the meeting, it's an effort to educate the president about a whole series of things, why we have 190,000 troops overseas, our trade deals, kind of our nuclear weapons posture, a whole series of things. And Mattis and Tillerson briefed Gary Cohn, who was then the chief of the economic advisors. And I think the meeting didn't go as planned for many of the people who were there. They wanted to persuade the president that all these, the overseas deployments and international trade agreements were operated.
Well, in the overall context, this is, and I call it a fetish.
Yeah.
This is the post-war international rules-based order,
and that is
of which that is the locked-in framework
and that is
of the established order, whether you're a Republican or Democrat in national security. And this is my point about why the Never Trumpers came out of that, because to even question that, it's like medieval theology. To even question the precepts or the underpinnings and the assumptions of that is to be demonized.
Well, Jim Mattis opened the meeting by saying, the international rules-based order has been to our benefit.
He said something more powerful. He said the greatest gift of the greatest generation.
Yes.
The greatest generation is revered as the people, not just the people that oversaw and won the war, the people actually did the fighting that actually won the war against the fascist and imperial Japan. They are mythic in American history now, right? As the greatest generation is just that. In the 14 or 15 generations we had in the greatest country on earth, they are the greatest of the great. So to say that tells you, to question it is like in medieval theology. You're going to burn at the stake, because it is not to be questioned. You do not start off with that. And the reason he starts off with that, that's the mindset. He wasn't trying to be dramatic. That's just a matter of fact.
Yeah. Obviously, Trump didn't agree with the contents of the briefing and kind of blew up. And
Well, but the American people also in electing him. This was the thing about Hillary Clinton versus him was not correct. Hillary Clinton was probably the best representative. And we said no one ever questioned her credentials. This whole thing about sexism and stuff like that, she was always viewed, I think, up until this thing started to be discussed, as someone they never questioned her national security bona fides, right? But she is the ether or the personification of this kind of globalist, the international rules-based order, whereas Trump from the beginning was looked at as a disruptor. To the fact that that's why the Republican establishment, the never-Trumpers came out of that. Now, they got very personal. It was about his character. He's a bad guy, everything like that. But the original thing was he's actually questioning the medieval theology.
Yeah, and I mean, he's been questioning it for a long time. In 1987, he took out an ad in the New York Times sort of saying essentially our allies are ripping us off, the Saudis and the Japanese. They're sort of, and I mean, there is an element of truth with this. They're not obviously ripping us off, but are they freeloading on the United States and it's not free riding on the United States? It's a fact that, you know, at a time, if you go back, many decades, we, as a percentage of global GDP, we are smaller than we used to be. Yet we still are, involved in all these defense arrangements. But I mean, part of that is, of course, the rise of the West, in the sense that other countries are doing better. It's not we're smaller part of the global pie, not because we're contracting, but because others, like the British, the French, the Germans, and the Japanese, have recovered from World War II. So on some level,
was this questioning? You said you think coup's too tough a word, and I've said that.
Coup, of course, coup's too tough a word.
But when you read Anonymous, and you've read Anonymous, and we see the original op-ed, and the New York Times said it was from a senior administration official, which I think is either cabinet level, undersecretary, agency head. It's one of the 100 top people. You saw Nikki Haley's book, which essentially reinforced what you said. In fact, she was a little more blunt in the fact that she confirmed something that even you couldn't confirm in your reporting. They actually had conversations, right, to say work together because we're not going to follow what this guy has to say. Is that now your definition of at least a soft coup?
It is. I'm just going to leave it at the facts. Jim Mattis certainly tried to slow roll.
But there's one thing. Let me go with one thing. You've covered the national security apparatus now for a long time.
Yeah.
Did your reporting shock you, just on the facts? Did it shock you of what you saw about the resistance to what the commander in chief wanted to implement?
It didn't shock me. But I mean, look, the White House people at the White House started referring to Mad Dog Mattis as Little Kitten Mattis, because basically he wouldn't produce the military options the president was asking for. Now, it is the commander-in-chief's prerogative to get the military options that he or she wants. And so, look, I mean, I'll leave it to listeners to kind of make their own conclusions about kind of what that means. Look, I mean, if you're a Democrat, what happens if Elizabeth Warren wins and there is
Bernie Sanders, or eventually one day if AOC wins?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question.
This is my point. This is why it is not about Trump personally, even given what some people think he's a hero, other people think he's a villain.
Yeah.
Leaving that aside, in your reporting in the thing, if you put Bernie Sanders, or if you put Elizabeth Warren, probably Elizabeth Warren not so much, you put Bernie Sanders, or in 2024, if she runs and if she wins, I'm saying she is, you put AOC, right, with her thing, is it going to be any different?
Look, Obama felt very strongly that the biggest thing that he did was put the military back in that box. I mean, he felt that you remember General McChrystal's assessment of the Afghan war, it's all going wrong, it got leaked, by whom is still not clear. That was very early in his first term. He felt that put him in a box, essentially forcing him to essentially do a surge in Afghanistan. This is not
which he did.
Which he did. It's not the first time in American history where, however you want to characterize, they have their own agenda, and sometimes they're going to win, sometimes they're going to lose, sometimes it's going to be a draw. I mean, certainly the military when Obama came into office, they wanted a surge in Afghanistan. They got it. He put a withdrawal date certain on that surge. They didn't like that. One of the kind of themes in the book is the extent to which some of these generals didn't like the way Obama approached Afghanistan or Syria. The system. Ultimately, I think the commander-in-chief has the card. He or she has the cards usually to win. And because at the end of the day, all these people we've just discussed are gone. They either were forced out, retired, resigned. They left sort of under some form of pressure, either self-created or because they were forced out.
Except for Dunford. Dunford.
Well, yeah,
Dunford had an.
Although even there, Dunford.
They did extend Dunford to another tour under.
But Trump announced his successor, General Milley, who was not Mattis's pick and was one of the reasons Mattis left. He announced him a year before Dunford resigned, so it makes Dunford kind of a lame duck for the rest of his term. And so now Trump has his, basically has his team. I think, I think they're less inclined to challenge him. I think instead of a team of rivals, we kind of have a team of acolytes. Again, the president it's in his or her right to, appoint the people that he or she wants. But is it smart, is the question. I mean, look at the Iran decision. You can debate the rights or wrongs of it, but how do we completely think through, like, second order, third order effects? I mean, you can overthink this. I mean, look, I go back to the Obama discussion.
He's done two actions post your reporting of the book, and actually, I think the book of the al-Baghdadi and General Soleimani. Is this a change that we want to cut the snake off from the head, or a decapitation?
I think the al-Baghdadi.
I think these are opportunistic.
Al-Baghdadi. Look, I mean, you have to give him real credit for a fairly risky decision. I mean, there was this whole question of crossing effectively Russian airspace that they control in Syria and deconflicting, and that all went well. And I think he's increasingly confident in his own military judgments in terms of
that President Trump is.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, you can see that.
You've been in the office. It's like he comes in, knows really nothing, and now he's like 3+ years in, or almost 3 years, and I think he is confident, and I think the Soleimani strike. There's still a lot of questions about kind of what prompted that exactly, but clearly, our system is very much a one-person decision making. When Obama took
the Constitution is actually written like that in times of a national crisis or national war.
Yeah.
That's that great scene.
Article 2 gives you
the great scene in Lincoln is that scene where they're haggling him about post offices for I think the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. He's finally had enough. He bangs the table, stands up, and says, "I'm the President of the United States," and endured with, he doesn't say virtually unlimited power, right? He's fighting a war at the time, and you can see that the structure of it in times of war. We're in the middle of, and during this interview, this whole war powers has now come up, and we're going to have actually an open debate and a vote today in the House of Representatives. As you see it, and particularly whether the slow roll, the soft coup, or the resistance to President Trump among the military establishment and the apparatus, how do you see the War Powers Act, this whole debate now about getting more power actually out, not just to the apparatus, but to the legislative branch?
Well, as an America First guy, Steve, I think you probably would be in favor of greater constraints on American, the commander-in-chief's ability. I mean, look, no one who voted for the authorization for the use of military force several days after 9/11 believed that it would continue, that we'd be, 18, 19 years later fighting wars in 7 Muslim countries. I mean, just like no one could,
Do you think the reason we are here 19 years later is because that was voted on and gave the executive branch too much power and not enough control by the Congress?
No one. They thought they were authorizing the defeat of the Taliban and the removal of Al Qaeda. I mean, so this is kind of
You're saying they never bought into 19 years in Afghanistan, nation building, $2 trillion, all that.
Look, if that was on if they were voting for that and they were clairvoyant, they presumably would have been it would have been structured. So look, but it's very hard, obviously, for a whole host of reasons to get some other author to change that. I think, but I think the mood is Trump was elected partly to get us out of these wars. So was Obama. The American if you survey the American public on the question is the United States too involved in the rest of the world, typically polling will show you that is a view of a lot of Americans. So,
overwhelming view.
Yeah. So the point is also, like, we don't know what's going to happen in 2020 or 2024, but this is a very stable view of the American public that we're kind of overextended, overcommitted. And so a War Resolution Act this is a non-binding resolution, but I think the Iran strike may give more energy to the idea, because there's no way you can kind of connect Soleimani to 9/11. I mean, the Vice President Pence made an effort in that direction. It didn't work very well. But at the end of the day, Congress is supposed to authorize these things. So of course, since the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, there hasn't. It tended. it's a long discussion, but the point is, I think that the war powers resolution that is right now before the House is indicative, and will get some Republican support.
I want to go because there's a couple other topics I want to
Yeah.
make sure we include. One, the Afghanistan papers.
Yeah.
It came out after the publication of your book.
Yeah.
What's your assessment of the honest? To me, it's
Yeah.
the most stunning thing that I've seen. It is as powerful as the Pentagon Papers. The only difference is we had a draft when the Pentagon Papers came out. We don't have a draft. We have 1% of the people that actually fight and die over there, so it hasn't resonated with the public.
Yeah.
But to the are you stunned by the revelations in it?
I'm not, because I mean, I was in Afghanistan last month. I mean, I've spent a lot of time there. I mean, look, everything that was in there is sort of like, well, the Afghan security services are corrupt. There's a big drug problem. I mean, like, none of this is sort of not well known, if you know. But
But it's not been spun to the American. I mean, we don't.
Right.
The Brown Watson Center says it's $2 trillion. Even the government admits it's $1 trillion. So between $2 trillion and $1 trillion we've spent, the place is worse today than we arrived.
Well,
and we've lost.
Steve,
we've lost 25.
I'm going to respectfully disagree.
Okay,
with you.
fine.
I was
good.
there under the Taliban time. I was there in the Civil War, and I mean, look, I mean, 70% of the population is under 30. Half the population are obviously women and girls. 15% are Shia. I mean, the vast majority don't want what they saw under the Taliban. So, the Afghan papers it's all true, but it's also incomplete in the sense that whole part of the story isn't really well told. I would also respectfully disagree with you about the Pentagon papers in the sense that having a draft changes everything, particularly when you have 56,000 Americans dead. It just, the politics around this are completely different.
Well, that's what I said. That's why.
Yeah.
That's why I said the Pentagon Papers are more powerful.
Yeah.
Because you had a draft and you were in the middle of a bigger shooting.
And
war.
a 19-year-old who volunteers to be in the army today knows that he or she is going to be part of a shooting war potentially in Afghanistan or elsewhere. So the politics are different. And I agree with you. Look, for a very major piece of journalism that probably will win the Pulitzer Prize, it really didn't get a lot of headroom. And part of it is also Americans just tune out stuff about Afghanistan at this point.
But why have they tuned out? Why have they tuned like to General Soleimani? We said in the show, in the live version of the show, he's not well known. I mean, he is. If you're in the Middle East or know the region, he's a legendary, almost mythic figure, right? But to the American population, until they took him out, he wasn't known. In fact, we talked on the show about President Trump probably at his rally, and you can see even yesterday is going to start to go make him famous. You've got to put this guy in his historical perspective for the American people, because he's clearly, I think, much more important than al-Baghdadi and probably at the level of Osama bin Laden, et cetera. But so why have the American people tuned out?
I mean, it goes in waves, right? I mean, isolationism and interventionism are part of the American story, and I mean, there's a kind of exhaustion with the war. Look, really interesting. When Jim Foley was killed by ISIS and beheaded on camera, and then other Americans were executed by ISIS, the Wall Street Journal does a poll about which of the stories Americans are paying the most attention to. It was the most highly paid attention to story of the past 5 years. So ISIS, look, I mean, ISIS was a big deal. In fact, I think, and as I say in the book, one of the reasons President Trump got elected was because he seemed to be stronger on terrorism than Hillary Clinton. And that way, you were during the campaign. Look, terrorism now is a sort of second order issue for Americans. During the campaign, it was a first order. So these things change. We were discussing, Harold Miller was asked when he became prime minister, what will determine his prime ministership? And he said, events, dear boy, events. I mean, so like this can change on a dime. Look, if we have a war in Iran where we really get sucked in and like hundreds of thousands of American troops are deployed, I don't think that's going to happen because it's in no one's interest. But then Iran will rise up. I mean, most if you go back to the Democratic Party debates that we've seen, I mean, foreign policy is barely mentioned.
It's a disgrace, and I got to call it CNN, which I think is the guys that cover the international news the best. You had the CNN debate 3 hours long. I think there was 1 or 2 questions on international affairs. The Democratic Party, to me, and I say this all the time, on the debate stage and even the issues they talk about when they go on small groups, it's like we're totally detached from the world as it is. I mean, do you disagree with that?
Well, I'm certainly not going to. I'm going to defend CNN. CNN does a lot of foreign coverage, and it has people in Tehran, Baghdad.
Yes.
Right now.
But wouldn't that make it the debate to be more?
Well, leaving aside a question about the debate.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm not picking on CNN. I'm saying they're the best of doing international news or covering it. You've got bureaus all over the world. If you go in a foreign country, the way you see the Americas too.
I'm going to go back to the Gore-Bush debates. The USS Cole being attacked by Al Qaeda. This is before 9/11. right? 17 American sailors have been killed. 200 of our people were killed at the embassy attacks in Africa. There was no discussion at all in these debates.
I remember that.
So
and we paid the price for that.
We paid the price for that. So the point is, there's a great line from Trotsky about you may not, it's Trotsky. You may not be interested in war, but
Right.
war is interested in you.
Right.
And this is really kind of, I think, an important point about America, which is, of course, we don't want to be involved, and it's messy, but like every president since Carter has been sucked into the Middle East in one way or another. Despite the fact we don't want to be there.
Even Reagan. Reagan said the biggest mistake he ever made in this thing was putting the Marines at the barracks in Lebanon.
And he did a very Trumpian thing, which is he pulled them out.
Exactly.
He didn't.
Well, he knew he did. Guys in the national security says, "Look, I got to win the war I'm fighting, which is against the Russians, and we're getting out of here."
Yeah. So one of the sort of sub themes of the book is the way that look, Trump got elected on this isolationist thing. So Obama sort of got elected in a non-interventionist.
You think it was isolationist or was it more non-intervention?
Yeah, isolationist is wrong. Both of them were elected on the idea like, let's get out of these endless wars.
We've got a few minutes left, and I want to make sure the book is Trump and His Generals: The Cost of Chaos. I think it's a must read. You get a great snapshot. It's not pro-Trump, but then again, it's not anti-Trump. What it is, I think, it shows you the moment of history we're in. And if you read it in conjunction with the Anonymous book, if you read Nikki Haley's book, and particularly read the Afghan Papers, you start to see that this is an enormously complex issue, and it is about the structure of the system. It's not just even the personality of President Trump. The same issues are going to come up in Bernie Sanders, if Bernie Sanders is ever elected president of the United States. One of the things that's most stunning, this goes back to Reagan, everybody gets sucked into the Middle East. What's most stunning about the book and even about things, and it goes back to what you said when we took, Baghdad in 2003. That leading general that was up there was Mad Dog Mattis, and his deputy was John Kelly, who eventually was the guy at the surge and became the quote unquote the strongest tribe when we went on the surge, and his one of his commanders was a guy named Colonel Dunford.
Yeah.
What comes through in this book is that that it's all about CENTCOM. These people have all worked together with each other. They've come up through the wars in the Middle East. And the wars in the Middle East have not just sucked up the presidents. It's literally sucked up the entire defense bureaucracy. It's the way they think. They're very, what I call CENTCOM-centric. That part of the world is everything. Where if you look at it the way I think I look at it and other people look at it, we have an existential threat in China. In China, quite frankly, I think the Iran, as they try to control the Eurasian landmass, Iran's their junior partner, Turkey's their junior partner, but Iran specifically is their junior partner to do that. And you do have some China in here, obviously, but it is quite stunning how the apparatus, China just is not even in the equation. It is very much a CENTCOM. It's very much the war on terror. It's very much the reason is that you go back and you see that 10, 15 years ago, they were working together in combat. All the people that come up there, assistant secretaries, deputy secretaries, that Asia, and you understand why Obama tried to have the pivot to Asia, and it didn't work under him. He couldn't bring the apparatus. He understood that, hey, this China thing is everything. I've got to pivot away from it. At the end, he gets a Marine brigade forward deployed in Darwin, and that's about it. I mean, they militarized the South China Sea. So many things go wrong, but Obama even knew intuitively, I've got to pivot out of here. I got a problem. The whole thing is wrapped around one thing that is probably not central to the future and prosperity of not just the United States, but to the industrial democracies and our allies throughout the world.
Yeah, I say in the book that historians will say that Trump largely got China right. There was a lot of wishful thinking about the Chinese. They liberalized their economy and then they would liberalize their politics. Well, the exact opposite has happened. They're doing more successfully financially, and they've essentially become a much more effective authoritarian state.
But why here's the thing: the intelligence community and the military apparatus missed that. There's just no doubt that they just didn't. They don't. And I can understand why the Wall Street interests. I can understand why the corporatists. I understand there is a direct monetary interest in shipping all the jobs to China and having slave labor in China. Make it your margins are higher, your stock prices are higher. Eventually, you're going to tap into the Chinese market. The industrial logic of the capitalist, I get. What I don't get, and you would know this better than anybody, the intelligence apparatus and the military, that kind of nexus of what we call national security, kind of so misses this. And why is it? I think people are going to question, particularly years from now, how did a hyperpower, it's been called, not a superpower, how did a hyperpower miss something that is so obvious in hindsight?
Well, I think two things. One, like you.
Am I wrong in that question? Is that
no?
wrong?
No, I think you're. I mean, look, we were losing a war in Iraq in 2005. I mean, General McChrystal and Mike Flynn and others who were. I mean, they knew the war was being lost. It wasn't. So, like, that sucks up a lot of energy. And I just think the apparatus doesn't do multiple things at once very well. I don't think.
Why is that?
It's human nature. I mean, look, if you have a bonfire going off in your backyard that is kind of consuming your backyard.
You're even saying if you go to World War II, it was really Germany first. The Pacific was a secondary consideration until.
And also, by the way,
even in the Great War, the Pacific never really got the.
In
focus
World War II, we spent 40% of our GDP on defeating the Nazis and the Japanese, and we had 18 million men and women in uniform in some shape. I mean, like the entire apparatus.
Full mobilization.
Full mobilization. Here we have a very different thing. But I would, I think the Trump team, and I include Jim Mattis and H.R. McMaster, because if you look at their national defense strategy and the national security strategy, it is very clear about what the threat from the China.
That was a very big focus in the summer, the 17. It came out in the first national security paper in the Trump administration was the war on terror is going to be kind of taken down a notch.
Yeah.
Besides, you got to take care of the physical caliphate of ISIS, but that. Russia's got to be thrown in the two, but China's a strategic competitor, and we're back to a great power struggle.
Yeah, and I think there were some real world outcomes from strategies can be written and then nothing can happen, right? I mean, there's a piece of, but in terms of freedom of navigation exercises under President Trump in the South China Sea, they've gone up. Clearly, there's a much more skeptical approach to China on questions of intellectual property theft, on the way they kind of control their markets, etc. That's all good. It doesn't mean that we're going to go to war with them, but I mean, I think taking a more skeptical approach is a good thing.
You think, in the one we always keep here is the Bible of the Chinese, unrestricted warfare, which
this is the Bible.
Unrestricted warfare, which really lays out information/cyber war, economic and kinetic. And so when you say that, do you believe we're actually engaged even today? And you see China's involvement, and I say they're the paymasters of the mullahs. I think people are missing that's why I was so enthusiastic about President Trump saying we're going to ratchet up the economic war. They say information war, economic war, and kinetic war. And they're very open about you do not want to take on the foreign devils in kinetic warfare. And kinetic warfare, these guys are the masters, and they understand the technology, but they also understand they have a doctrine of how to fight. And so we want to avoid that either as long as possible or forever. But we can win on information/cyber, and we definitely can win on economic warfare. Do you think today, as you define warfare, that we're actually in a war with the Chinese Communist Party, particularly information war and a economic war?
We're certainly in a conflict, and they themselves do not want to be in an open war with us or a real war with us for all sorts of reasons. And so the big question, and I think this is an unknowable question to the Chinese themselves, is like, do they essentially have a Monroe Doctrine for much of Asia, where they just want to force us out? Or do they want to, become the world's superpower and displace us? And they themselves don't know the answer to that question. And, we don't, certainly I think they do have a Monroe Doctrine for a good chunk of Asia.
You think East Asia, the South China Sea, that's where they're...
South China Sea for sure. I mean, they want to turn it into a Chinese lake. That's what they're doing. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, if you look at a map, the South China Sea is not, it's kind of the sea is really kind of misleading. It's a very, very big piece of territory that they are claiming. 1,000 miles from the coast of China with a 9-dotted line. And, so they have this. Now,
and they say that's an internal sea and that's a sovereign territory.
Yeah. So is it a Thucydides trap question where the rising power and the dominant power are inevitably going to have a conflict? The only time it hasn't happened was between the British and the United States. Look, no one knows, including them and including us. We just don't. I mean, but I do think it was in the Trump administration. I think was right to sort of and then, by the way, this is. I think there's quite a lot of consensus on the Democrat and the Republican side now on this issue about China. Now, I think that
are you pretty amazed about how now that Mike Pence and Secretary Pompeo go out and talk about a whole of government approach in a confrontation, strategic competitors, the shift you've seen over the last couple of years, where the Middle East is everything and the maniacal focus, and now you've actually had a real pivot. You've had a real pivot, not just to Asia, but against the Chinese Communist Party. Did that shock you as how quickly it's been done?
Well, I mean, it's happened, but the other thing is events do intervene. I mean, look, we have shifted. The Pentagon has shifted assets to Asia and essentially made it harder to deal with the Middle East. But look at what's happened in the last year, which is we've shifted a lot of assets back into the Middle East. So the events are going to determine kind of some of these strategic questions, whatever strategic framework we put on it. And the fact is the 20,000 American troops that are now in the Middle East that weren't there, a year ago, and we've sent a big aircraft carrier over there, and so that.
I want to talk about method real quickly about that. But in 2001 and 2002, when you were everywhere on CNN, and this was the whole thing, people didn't know what had happened and couldn't understand how, why did they hate us, that could happen. Did you ever think at that time that 20 years in the future that you would be sitting on Capitol Hill and having a discussion about the details of the Afghan war and still 14 or 15,000 troops there? Did you ever envision at the time that this would be something that would be the country would be disengaged in, probably more so than back then, 20 years in the future?
Of course not. But did the people who in 1953 envisioned there'd be 25,000 American troops in South Korea and that we'd still be in a sort of state of conflict of some kind with the North Koreans?
And that 10 years later you'd be starting to lose 50,000 kids in Vietnam.
Yeah. So history, there is no end to history.
That's definitely not a recommendation of another book that was written that shows you the neocons, the complete clueless. Last, I want to talk to you about method, because every time I do this, people want to know about writers. How do you do your research? Point us to young people.
Okay.
What time of day do you write? How many hours a day do you write?
Okay.
You get two.
I have a really easy approach. I don't have an alarm clock. I get up because of anxiety and often very early. Like, so 4:30 in the morning, 5 in the morning, I start writing. And I have other day jobs, but I don't need an alarm clock when I'm writing a book. I just get up because the anxiety is telling me you need to get up and write it. And I write. I enjoy writing, which I think is important for readers. If I'm finding it hard or boring or difficult to write, then why would the reader enjoy it? So I try and make it a good read. This book number 6, I make fewer mistakes. I'm a better writer.
What were the mistakes you made in the early
Well, yeah, a very classic mistake is I must know everything. Now, it's impossible to know everything, but
your research goes on forever.
Yeah, you just kind of you keep going, and it gets bigger, and you suddenly have 50 boxes of research, and it's like you can't know everything. You got at some point you got to sort of say, I know the highlights and the book tries to cover quite a lot of waterfront, North Korea, Afghanistan, Iran, the Qatar, Saudi Arabia. It's like I can't know everything about Saudi politics. At a certain point, you just got to say, I know enough for the purposes of this book. So, I also when you start writing, my first book I just was sort of writing without really a real plan, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. So.
You laid a very structured plan for yourself, almost the chapters or the events.
Yeah, and of course the events happened, and one of the with a book like this, where do you end? I mean, I end with the Turkish invasion of Syria, which is the last. But obviously every week or month there's some pretty major development. I wish I could have had the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's death in here as a sort of ending, because I think it shows Trump more confident in his own military judgments, or the Soleimani thing, because it says a lot of things about the Iran, our relationship with Iran. But I talked to a lot of people for the book, about 100 various. I went to Afghanistan twice, Saudi Arabia twice, Qatar twice, Iraq twice. So it's not just some book about. One thing about Woodward. Woodward was an amazing reporter, but it's a very airless account because it's always in the Situation Room.
Yeah, and it's talking to people that were around, not.
But also less sense of what is happening in Afghanistan or Saudi, and so. Are we?
No, we're good.
Okay. But so that's my approach. Get up early, write, talk
Do
to.
you go if you do an outline? Are there certain parts of the book that you feel write themselves? So you go to that first, or are you linear? Do you start at the beginning and write it all the way through the end?
No, I mean, I tell you, some people are more helpful than others. You know, I try and look. I'm trying to write history. I'm not writing sort of daily news. And so one thing I do is I try and prep the people that I'm talking to about what I'm interested in. So I'll send them a very detailed memo about the questions I'm going to ask, the themes, what it like, so that people aren't surprised or can do some thinking. Because it's not like I'm not trying to do a gotcha interview.
Yeah.
I'm not trying. It's about like what happened, and you know, when in the impressive events, like things that happened 3 years ago, and you're in the White House. It's like you need some time to sort of think about, well, what happened in that meeting.
Are we hurting ourselves in that back? If you look in the 60s, 70s, 50s, you had more books like this, or is it now we're so polarized? And you mentioned at the very beginning of the show that you're so polarized that it really comes from your perspective, and if you see it on Fox, you'll buy it and it'll reinforce it. If you see it on MSNBC,
I think
never the twain shall meet.
The polarization is a problem. I mean, Rachel Maddow did a segment about the book. She loved it. I haven't been on her show, but you know, you have me on your show. You say you like it. So I mean, the fact is that
it's got definitely a lot of snark about President Trump, but it's got to be. I think the way that the Trump supporters should buy this book, Trump and His Generals: The Cost of Chaos. You see actually the first cut of kind of what he was up against, and what's you go into very big detail of what the apparatus is and how he interfaced with it.
Yeah,
you're not going to. Trump supporters are not going to like everything about it, but it's a historic document.
Well, so the fact that you like it, the fact that Rachel Maddow did a segment about it, to me, this is kind of important validation, because obviously you're politically quite different. But the point is that this is a consequential presidency. There are certain facts that actually happened that are important to surface, and some of them don't make the president look at all good, and some of them make the president look much better. So, but I wasn't trying to make
his hindsight.
I wasn't trying to make him look good or bad. I was interested in him as the president. And
well, the one thing, if you read this book, you can understand how the General Soleimani raid came up. That he now has more of his sea legs and more of his confidence in his own ability to think through geopolitical situations and military situations. The book is Trump and His Generals: The Cost of Chaos, Peter Bergen. I think that if you're a Trump supporter, or even if you want to find out more about understanding what's going on, particularly the direction of the Trump presidency and the populist nationalist national security, and against this kind of the international rules-based order, which has some good elements to it, but is certainly something that has to be questioned. It's a must-read, so thank you very much for coming into the War Room. Episode 107.